Hello. So now I am in another section of our textbook, and probably this is, in my opinion, the most important topic for this class. So it's very important that we understand this section and that you spend particular time trying to understand it. What are we going to learn? Well, in this section, we are going to learn about reflexive verbs. I'm going to write a little bit here for you. Reflexive verbs. This is what we are going to learn about reflexive verbs. These are specific verbs in Italian that convey specific types of action. Now, they do not exist in English. So, in order to understand them, you have to try to think a little bit differently from English. I'm going to try to make it a simple explanation for you in this sense. First of all, notice the name of these verbs, right? Reflexive verbs. What does it mean? It means that the action of these verbs falls on the subject itself. The action of these verbs falls on the subject itself. What does it mean? It's an action that we do to ourselves. It's an action that we do to ourselves. What can be an action like this? Well, like I said, in English, we don't really have a precise match for these types of verbs. But some actions that are very common and that exist in English, in Italian are conveyed through reflexive verbs. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I'm first going to write these verbs in Italian. So we have the verb, for example, svegliarsi, addormentarsi, lavarsi. These are among the most common. Reflexive verbs. Also riposarsi, prepararsi, and divertirsi. I'll tell you in a second what all these verbs mean. I'm going to translate them for you right here. Okay, so svegliarsi means to wake up. Addormentarsi means to fall asleep. Lavarsi means to wash yourself. This is better. To rest, riposarsi. To prepare, and divertirsi, to have fun. Let's take in consideration some regular verbs. Some verbs we studied in the past. Let's take in consideration some verbs we studied in the past. These verbs that we have studied in the past, if you notice all these verbs, for example, the verb, I don't know, fare, andare, uscire, right? These verbs, as you can see, some verbs studied in the past end with are, right? Ere or ire, right? That's what we have learned, actually, right? That usually verbs in Italian belong to one of these three categories, right? First, second, or third conjugation. Reflexive verbs, instead, end differently, and that's how we recognize them. They end with si. The infinitive of the verb ends with si. However, I want you to understand that even if they end with si in Italian, even if they end with si in Italian, these verbs, even if they end with si, they still belong to one of these three categories, are, ere, or ire. Where do you see? Well, look at this. Here I have are, which means that this verb belongs to the first conjugation. Here I have are, again, belongs to the first conjugation, and so on and so forth. All of these verbs here belong to the first conjugation, but divertirsi, right, which belongs divertirsi belongs to the third conjugation because it's ire. Okay? So as you can see, all these verbs belong to a specific, all these verbs belong to a specific conjugation. Now, again, let's reflect together on what does it mean, this thing of the reflexive verb. Like I said, the action fall to on the subject. Let's take, for example, the verb to wake up. In Italian, we don't say I wake up. In Italian, I say I wake myself up. Which sounds strange in English, of course, but that's how it is. Okay. The same thing with to fall asleep. In Italian, we say I fall myself asleep. I wash myself, and this is pretty clear. I rest myself. I rest myself for riposarsi. I prepare myself. I prepare myself. And I enjoy. That's how we say to have fun. I enjoy myself. Okay, so as you can see, these verbs convey, that's what I meant when I say that these verbs convey actions that fall on the subject. If we go on our textbook here, you will find this explanation. So study this section. Now, the interesting thing is that before I told you that these verbs belong to the same conjugations, right? The first, the second, or the third. However, and they're mostly like conjugated in the same way, so there's nothing new that you have to learn. However, when you conjugate a reflexive verb, you have to use a reflexive. You have to use a reflexive pronoun. This is a very important thing that we have to understand. So when we conjugate a reflexive verb, we have to use a reflexive pronoun. What is the reflexive pronoun? Well, it's this thing that you see here on the book, right? For each subject, you have a different reflexive pronoun. Something that in a sense means myself, yourself, himself or herself, ourselves, yourselves, plural, themselves. So this is basically the reflexive pronoun. So when you conjugate a reflexive verb, you have to put the reflexive pronoun before the conjugation of the verb. Let me give you an example with the verbs that I was using right now. Let me give you an example with the verb, for example, svegliarsi, to wake up. Svegliarsi, right? If I want to conjugate the verb svegliarsi, I'm going to write all the thing. If I want to conjugate the svegliarsi, before conjugating, so conjugating the svegliarsi, are, it's a verb of the first conjugation, right? So it's conjugated normally. However, I have to put this. So if I want to say I wake up, I'm going to say io mi sveglio. If I want to say you wake up, I'm going to say tu ti svegli. If I'm going to say he or she wakes up, I'm going to say lui o lei si sveglia, si sveglia. If I'm going to say we wake up, I'm going to say noi ci svegliamo. If I'm going to say you all wake up, I'm going to say voi vi svegliate, vi svegliate. And if I want to say they wake up, I'm going to say loro si svegliano. And this that I just do, what I just did with the verb svegliarsi, what I just did with the verb svegliarsi basically applies to all the other reflexive verbs. So for example, you can try to make an exercise for yourself and try to conjugate all these other verbs that you have right here according to this pattern. And maybe we can do it also when I'll see you on Monday to practice them. All of these, like I said, is explained very well on the book, so I would recommend that you study this section carefully. I'm going to assign all these exercises here, 8, 9, 11, 8, 9, 11. Let's see if there's anything else now. 8, 9, 11. These are the three exercises that I'm going to assign on this topic from the book. I'm not going to go over the exercises that you're going to have on the quiz on this topic, because it's a regular exercise that you have already had in the past. You have the verb in parentheses, the blank space. You have to conjugate the verb accordingly depending on the subject, and we will simply go over it together when I'll see you on Monday.